She was just a quiet girl in a hoodie, sitting in business class. But the moment airport staff saw her, they assumed she didn't belong. They kicked her out, humiliated her in front of everyone, and thought they could get away with it. But what they didn't know was that her father was Chuck Norris, and he was on his way. And when he arrived, everything changed. Myra Norris was just 13 years old, but there was something in her eyes that told the story of a girl who had seen more than most adults, something silent and powerful, like waves rolling beneath the surface of calm waters. She wasn't like the others in business class. Her hoodie was a size too big. Her backpack looked worn and patched, and her sneakers bore the signs of many long walks through city streets and lonely airports. But what truly made her stand out in that shining row of suited businessmen and ladies with designer handbags was the way she sat perfectly still, eyes fixed on the window as the rain tapped gently against the glass. Outside, the plane was late that morning. The passengers were irritated, but Myra didn't flinch. She had traveled alone before, but never like this. This trip was supposed to be special. Her first solo flight across the country to surprise her father in Texas, a man the world knew as a legend. But to her, he was simply Dad, the one who taught her how to punch the right way, how to be strong, how to stand tall even when everything around her was falling apart. But Myra didn't wear that badge on her chest. She didn't need to. She carried her strength quietly, like a hidden sword. And yet, the silence was broken when two airport staff approached her, their faces stiff, their uniforms freshly pressed, as if trying to look more official than necessary. The taller one, Officer Simmons, leaned forward as if inspecting her from a distance too close for comfort. "Excuse me, miss, do you have a ticket for the seat?" he asked, not kindly, not cruelly, but with a tone that expected her to fail. Myra reached into her bag calmly, pulled out her boarding pass, and handed it to him. He looked it over, frowned, then turned to his partner. "She's in business class," he muttered, as if that explained something suspicious. The woman beside him, Officer Clara, folded her arms and said, "Business class? Really? Where are your parents?" Myra blinked slowly. "I'm traveling alone," she said quietly. "My father is meeting me in Texas." That was all she said, nothing more, nothing less. But somehow, it wasn't enough. The staff exchanged glances, and for a moment, Myra could see it. The way doubt twisted into their expressions, the way they scanned her face, her hoodie, her shoes, as if her appearance invalidated the truth printed clearly on that boarding pass. "We need to confirm this," Officer Simmons said. "We're going to need you to step off the plane." Myra didn't argue. She didn't cry. She stood up gently, picked up her bag, and followed them back through the narrow aisle of judgmental stares and whispered comments. She walked off the plane and into the bright, artificial light of the terminal, where they sat her down on a plastic chair near gate B-22. They asked her again and again who she was, where she was going, why she was in business class, and each time she gave the same answers. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't plead. She just waited and waited for someone to listen. But no one did. Instead, the staff began murmuring about fraud, about forged tickets, about how a girl like her couldn't possibly afford such a seat. And all the while, Myra sat still, her hands folded, her back straight, her eyes never blinking, because she knew this wasn't about her seat, or her ticket, or her silence. This was about the way people see what they want to see, and nothing more. And then, just as Officer Simmons was about to call security again, Myra reached into her bag and pulled out a photograph. It was a picture of her and her father standing by a lake, a wide smile across her face, and beside her the unmistakable figure of Chuck Norris, the man, the myth, the legend, holding a fishing rod and laughing like the world had no weight at all. She handed the photo to Simmons without a word. He looked at it, scoffed, and said, "Anyone could Photoshop that. You expect us to believe Chuck Norris is your dad?" And for the first time, Myra's voice grew colder. "Believe what you want," she said quietly, "but when he gets here, you'll regret this." And it was then at that exact moment that the energy in the terminal shifted, because a call had just been made, not by Myra, but by someone who saw what was happening. A flight attendant named Rachel, who had worked for 20 years and knew the look of discrimination when she saw it. She had recognized the last name on the boarding pass, and something in her gut told her this was wrong. So she picked up her phone and dialed a number she had never expected to use. She had recognized the last name on the boarding pass, and something in her gut told her this was wrong. So she picked up her phone and dialed a number she had never expected to use. And on the other end of that line was a voice so calm it could still water. Rachel explained everything, and the voice on the other end simply said, "I'm on my way." 30 minutes later, the airport went still as the sliding glass doors opened, and in walked a man who needed no introduction, a man whose walk alone commanded silence. Chuck Norris was not wearing a suit. He didn't need to. He wore denim jeans, a plain shirt, and a leather jacket that had seen storms, deserts, and wars. His eyes scanned the terminal like a hawk, and when he spotted his daughter sitting in that cold plastic chair, he didn't rush. He didn't shout. He just walked to her, stood beside her, and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. She nodded. That was all he needed to hear. And then he turned to the staff, his voice calm but thunderous. "Who decided to remove my daughter from her seat?" he asked, not with anger, but with something more dangerous than rage, cold purpose. Officer Simmons stammered. She looked suspicious. "We thought it was fraud." "And who told you that?" Chuck asked, holding up the ticket she had paid for with his own credit card, booked under his own account, with his name attached to the emergency contact, the same contact no one bothered to call. Simmons opened his mouth, but no words came out. And in that silence, Chuck Norris took a step forward, and the entire terminal seemed to hold its breath. "You see," he said slowly, "you judge my daughter by how she looked. Not by what she said, not by the proof she offered. You didn't ask. You assumed. And because of that, you humiliated her in front of 100 strangers. You made her feel unsafe, unworthy, and unwelcome. And that is something I do not take lightly." Simmons tried to speak again, but Chuck raised a hand. Not in violence, just in silence. And somehow, that was more effective than any punch. "You see," he continued, "my daughter is stronger than you know. She's trained. She's brave. But she shouldn't have to be. Not here. Not for a simple flight home." And then he turned to Myra, smiled, and said, "Come on, kid. Let's go home." And as they walked back toward the gate, the same people who had stared in judgment now parted silently, some whispering apologies, others simply stunned. And somewhere behind them, Officer Simmons stood frozen, the weight of his mistake crashing down like a storm too late to stop. And just as they reached the jet bridge, Chuck turned back one last time and said, "Next time, before you judge someone, look a little closer. Because sometimes the quiet ones have the loudest stories." And with that, he and Myra disappeared into the plane, leaving behind a silence that spoke louder than any shout ever could. The flight home was quiet, but not in the way that silence usually feels. It was the kind of quiet that held weight, like the calm after a storm when debris still floats in the air and the ground is wet with aftermath. Myra sat beside her father, her fingers tapping lightly against the armrest, her eyes still watching the clouds outside, but her mind far away. Chuck didn't ask questions, not yet. He knew better than anyone that pain doesn't always scream. Sometimes it sits quietly, waiting for the right moment to unfold. So he let her breathe, let her hold the silence until she was ready. And when she finally spoke, her voice was like glass, smooth but sharp. "They didn't even look at the name," she said. "I told them the truth, but it didn't matter. They saw what they wanted to see and decided I didn't belong." Chuck didn't reply, not immediately. Instead, he closed his eyes and remembered a time decades ago when he too had been treated like a nobody. The time before the fame, before the movies, before the legend. Back when all he had was grit and anger and the iron will to survive. And he remembered how that felt. And it hurt him more than any blow he had taken in the ring to know his daughter had felt the same thing. And so when they landed and the cameras began flashing and airport management came running to apologize, to offer free vouchers and luxury upgrades and apologies printed in polite words, Chuck turned it all down. He didn't want headlines. He didn't want noise. He wanted answers, and more than that, he wanted change. But first he had to talk to Myra, really talk. So they left through a quiet exit, avoiding the reporters who had somehow already heard whispers of the incident, and drove in silence through the streets of Dallas until they reached a cabin hidden deep in the hills. A place far from the world, a place where Myra had learned to fish, where Chuck had taught her how to track footprints and listen to the wind and feel the earth breathe. And it was there on the porch, as the sun began to dip beneath the trees, that Myra finally let it all out. Not in words, but in tears. And Chuck said nothing, just sat beside her, held her hand, and waited until she was done. And then he said softly, "People fear what they don't understand, and they judge what they fear. But you don't have to carry their ignorance. That's not yours to hold." And Myra nodded, wiped her face, and asked a question that struck deeper than any wound. Why does the world need someone powerful to believe you before they listen? Chuck didn't answer because the truth was heavy, and sometimes silence says more than truth. And the next morning, as the dew still kissed the grass, Myra stood barefoot outside the cabin, eyes closed, breathing slow and calm. And Chuck watched her from the window, proud and heartbroken all at once, because he saw her strength and knew it had come from pain. And that was a burden no child should carry. But she wasn't just a child. She was his daughter, and she had a fire in her that no judgment could extinguish. Later that day, Chuck received a call, not from the media, not from lawyers, but from a quiet voice in airport security. A man named Raymond, who had been working that shift and had seen everything, but had said nothing at the time. And now he couldn't sleep. He couldn't stop thinking about the way Myra had been treated and how he had stood in silence, afraid to lose his job, afraid to speak up. And now he wanted to do something, anything. So Chuck met him quietly in a small diner far from the city. And Raymond brought something more valuable than an apology. He brought evidence, security footage, audio logs, internal memos, all showing how profiling and silent bias had grown like a weed through airport protocol. How people were being flagged based on nothing more than how they looked or dressed. How children were separated from flights. How elderly passengers were interrogated without cause. And Myra's case was just the one that happened to go public. Chuck listened carefully, and when Raymond was done, he leaned forward and said, "This isn't just about my daughter. This is about every person who was made to feel small without a reason. And if you're willing to help me, we're going to change that." And Raymond nodded, because for the first time, he felt less like a coward and more like a man doing the right thing. And so began a quiet storm, a movement that didn't start with protests or banners, but with quiet meetings in quiet rooms. Chuck used no fame, no cameras. He called veterans, lawyers, advocates, teachers, and passengers who had stories too painful to tell. And one by one, they joined hands behind the scenes, building a case, gathering stories. And all the while Myra trained, not in martial arts, not in silence, but in something harder, public speaking. She learned how to stand in front of strangers and speak her story without trembling. She stood in courtrooms, in conferences, in classrooms, telling the world not just what happened, but what it meant. And her words carried weight because they weren't polished. They weren't scripted. They were real and raw and sharp. And people listened, not because she was Chuck Norris's daughter, but because she spoke the truth. And slowly, policies began to change. Airports added new training modules. Sensitivity screening was redesigned. Oversight panels were formed. And a public apology was finally issued, not just to Myra, but to every passenger who had been treated unfairly. And one day, months later, Chuck and Myra returned to that same airport, not for revenge, but for closure. They walked through security together, eyes watching them again, but this time differently. This time with recognition, with respect. And as they passed Gate B-22, where it had all started, Myra saw a little girl sitting nervously, alone. And without a word, she walked over, knelt down, and asked her if she needed help. The girl nodded wide-eyed, and Myra smiled and said, "Come on, I'll walk with you." And in that moment, the circle closed, not in anger, not in fire, but in kindness. And that was the moment Chuck knew his daughter didn't just survive. She transformed, and in doing so, she lit a path for others to follow. The sun had barely risen on the morning Myra received the invitation that would change everything. It arrived in a simple white envelope. No stamps, no markings, just her name handwritten in careful script. She opened it slowly, and inside was a letter printed on heavy paper and sealed with a gold crest. It was from the Global Aviation Ethics Council, an organization she had never heard of before, but whose words would echo in her memory forever. They were holding an international summit in Geneva to address rising concerns of discrimination in travel, security, and treatment of passengers, and they wanted Myra to be the keynote speaker. Not Chuck, not his lawyers, not some polished politician, but her, because her story had traveled further than she ever had, across borders, screens, newspapers, and hearts. And the council believed she carried something that no policy paper could: authenticity and fire. Myra read the letter twice, then looked up at her father, who had just walked into the room with 2 mugs of tea. She didn't say anything at first, just handed him the invitation. He read it slowly, his brow furrowing then softening, and without a word, he placed the mugs down, smiled, and said, "I guess it's time to pack." And so began a journey neither of them expected. Not just across the ocean, but into the very heart of a system that had long buried its flaws beneath bureaucracy and procedures and denial. When they arrived in Geneva, the air was cold and clean, the city sharp with glass buildings and cobblestone streets. Myra stood before the towering conference hall, dressed not in a suit or a gown, but in the same gray hoodie she had worn the day she was removed from her flight, a quiet act of defiance and truth. The security staff at the entrance looked her over. One of them hesitated, but then recognized her name on the list and waved her through. And inside the hall, she saw faces from everywhere: politicians, journalists, advocates, victims, people who had been profiled, detained, removed, questioned, all for reasons that had nothing to do with their actions and everything to do with assumptions. And then it was her turn. She stepped up to the podium, lights shining, eyes watching, cameras ready to broadcast her voice to the world. And she paused, not from fear, but from gravity. The moment weighed heavy, because this wasn't about revenge or blame. It was about breaking a silence that had lasted too long. And so she spoke slowly, deliberately, telling the story from the start. But this time, she added what it felt like: how the stares cut deeper than words, how the shame burned beneath her skin, how it wasn't just one bad staff member or one mistake, but a pattern, a system that quietly punished those who didn't fit the mold. And then she did something unexpected. She forgave them all, not because they deserved it, but because she refused to carry their judgment any longer. And the hall went silent, not from shock, but from awe, because they knew they were not just witnessing a speech. They were witnessing a shift, a ripple in the tide. And when she finished, the applause was slow but thunderous, like rain falling on a dry land. One clap, then another, then a storm of hands rising to honor her, not as Chuck Norris's daughter, but as Myra, a name now etched into history. That evening, back at the hotel, Myra stood on the balcony, looking out over the lake below, her thoughts still racing. And Chuck joined her, holding a small wooden box in his hands. "I was waiting for the right time," he said quietly. She turned to him and opened the box. Inside was an old medal, tarnished but still shining, a symbol of his first martial arts championship decades ago. Engraved on the back were the words, "Strength is born not in victory, but in rising after the fall." He handed it to her and said, "You've earned this more than I ever did." And Myra didn't cry. She simply held the medal close, her eyes soft and bright. And for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to exhale. Truly exhale. But the story didn't end there. Because when they returned to the United States, something strange began to happen. Myra started receiving letters, hundreds of them, from children, teenagers, parents, elderly people all around the world who had seen her speech and felt something awaken inside them. People who had been silenced for too long, suddenly finding the courage to speak up. One letter came from a girl in India who had been denied boarding because her wheelchair didn't fit the gate ramp. Another from a boy in Brazil who was pulled from the line because his last name sounded suspicious. And every letter told a story, not of weakness, but of quiet strength. And Myra read every single one, replying to as many as she could. And then she had an idea, a wild, brave, world-changing idea. She would start something, a foundation not for victims, but for voices. A space where stories could be told, collected, amplified, where people could find legal support, emotional healing, and a platform of fight back. She called it the Quiet Seat, named after the chair she had sat in at Gate B22, where everything had begun. And it grew fast, faster than anyone expected, because truth travels faster than fear. And soon she was being invited to schools, to tech companies, to government panels to share what she had built. And everywhere she went, she wore that same hoodie. Now, a symbol not of defiance, but of clarity. And Chuck watched her quietly, always in the background, always proud but never overbearing. Because he knew this was her fight, her fire. And he was just there to protect it, if needed. But she didn't need protection. Not anymore. Not when her voice had become a shield. Not when her story had become a sword. And one night, months later, she found herself back at that same airport. Not for business, not for protest, but just passing through. And as she waited at the gate, she saw something strange. A little boy being questioned by security, his mother in tears, his papers scattered. And without hesitation, Myra walked over, calmly, quietly, and said, "I'm with the Norris Foundation. This child is under our protection." And suddenly everything stopped. Eyes widened, voices quieted, and the officers backed away, not because of fear, but because of recognition and respect. And the mother wept and hugged her and whispered thank you in a dozen different languages. And Myra smiled, helped them up, and guided them to their gate. And as they walked away, Chuck stepped from behind a nearby column and said, "I guess you still need me for backup sometimes." And she laughed and said, "Maybe, but not as much as before." And in that laughter, in that light, something powerful was born. A new chapter, a new era, not just for her, but for all the voices that would follow her through the gates, through the walls, through every space that once made them feel small. And with that, the girl in the gray hoodie walked on, not just as a passenger, but as a pathfinder. Time moved faster than anyone expected. Seasons changed, cities evolved, and Myra Norris continued her quiet revolution without seeking fame, without craving attention. She walked in and out of airports around the world, not as a passenger, but as a protector of those who had once sat in silence like her. Her foundation, the Quiet Seat, had grown beyond anything she imagined. It had legal teams, outreach centers, virtual help desks, translators, and emotional trauma experts, ready at all hours of the day. Ready for the next story. Ready for the next voice that dared to whisper truth into a world that often refused to listen. But the weight of it all did not go unnoticed. Even strength gets tired. Even warriors need rest. And one night, after a particularly heavy flight where she had helped an elderly man wrongfully blacklisted from flying, Myra sat on a quiet bench outside the airport, watching planes climb through the sky like metal birds disappearing into freedom. And for the first time in a long while, she felt small. Not weak, just small. Like a girl again. Like the one who had been pulled off a plane without explanation, without compassion. And as the wind passed through her hair, she wondered if it had all been worth it. All the interviews, all the policies, all the letters, all the battles. And just as doubt began to settle quietly, like dusk, she heard footsteps, slow, steady, familiar. And then a voice beside her, soft and grounding. "You know, you don't have to carry the whole sky on your shoulders." And she turned and smiled, because it was Chuck, not as the legend, not as the warrior, but as her father, the same man who had taught her how to fish, how to listen to the forest, how to understand silence, not as emptiness, but as space for truth. And she leaned her head against his shoulder. And for a while, they just sat there, father and daughter, two souls that had walked through fire and come out holding hands. "Do you remember the first time I flew alone?" she asked quietly. And he nodded. "Do you remember the look they gave me, like I was invisible, like I didn't matter?" And Chuck clenched his fist slightly, but said nothing. And Myra continued, "I promised myself that day that if I ever made it through this, I'd make sure no one else had to feel like that ever again. And you did, he said. You didn't just make it through. You turned that pain into purpose. You built something that outlived the moment. And that matters more than they will ever know. But what if it's not enough? She asked. What if the system finds new ways to stay broken? What if all we did was put a bandage on a wound that never heals? And Chuck looked at her, not with answers, but with love, and said, maybe we can't change everything, but we can change someone. And that's enough to keep trying. That's enough to keep going. And Myra breathed deeply and nodded. And in that breath, something returned. Something quiet and powerful. Her fire. Not the raging kind, but the steady kind, like the glow of coals that never goes out, even in the storm. Weeks later, she was back at another summit. This time not to speak, but to listen. And as she stood at the edge of the room, she heard a young girl take the stage. Her voice trembling at first, then steady as she told her own story of being detained at customs for hours, separated from her family, forced to sign documents she couldn't read. And when the girl finished, she looked out into the crowd and said, I only found the strength to speak because someone else did first. Someone named Myra Norris. And Myra felt tears in her eyes, not from sadness, but from recognition, because she had become the echo, the first domino, the voice that gave permission for others to speak. And as the room rose in applause, the girl ran off stage and straight into Myra's arms and whispered, thank you. And Myra whispered back, no, thank you. And in that hug, in that moment, the years of pain, the nights of doubt, the battles fought, and scars earned all made sense. Because this wasn't just a story anymore. It was a movement. It was a chain reaction. It was legacy. And that night, as she sat again on a plane flying home, she closed her eyes. Not because she was tired, but because for the first time in a long time, she felt peace. She looked down at the medal Chuck had given her, now worn from being held too often, and she smiled. Because it was no longer just a memory. It was a symbol. And then the pilot's voice came over the speaker, announcing turbulence. But Myra didn't flinch. She never did anymore. And somewhere deep down, she knew this wasn't the end. Not even close. Because there would always be another story. Another quiet seat. Another person who needed someone to believe them. And as long as she could stand, she would be there. And even one day, when she could no longer walk through those gates herself, she knew someone else would. Someone who had heard her story and decided to rise. Someone who believed that even the smallest voice could shake the biggest walls. And in that truth, in that unshakable hope, the journey would never end.